All right, everyone. Hello. Sorry, that made me feel very powerful. Hi, good evening. Are you all well? I'm fine, thanks for asking. Good. So welcome to our event as part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science. So to get us all started, I'd like you to join me in a round of applause to welcome our panelists to the stage. So please welcome our panel, ladies and gentlemen. So, as I said, this is part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science, and my name is Andrew Dorman. I'm the Research and Policy Officer for this centre that you can't see because of the way the projector is. It's the Centre of Economics, Policy and History. And when the ESRC, or we came to the ESRC and told them we'd like to do an event, they said absolutely, but they did give us some advice. They suggested that we make sure that the content is engaging. Fair enough. They also suggested that we make sure it's fairly interactive and we get a conversation going. And they said, without any question, make sure that it doesn't come across as patronizing in any way, because academics have a tendency of talking down. So we called it, I Told You So, How Economics Can Use Past Disasters to Predict the Future. And that's what we're going to attempt to do over the next 45 minutes or so, or an hour, depending on the Q&A session at the end. And we're going to be having a back and forth and looking at particular case studies from the past and the lessons that we can learn about them and apply to the future. And, well, I won't be doing that. They'll be doing that. And the panel joining me today is Dr. William Quinn from Queen's University, Belfast. He's a senior lecturer in finance. We have Dr. Áine Doran from Ulster University. And we also have reader Chris Colvin from Queen's University, Belfast. Now, all three of these are economic historians, so they make a very one-dimensional pub quiz team. But they are very good at what they do, and they're all expert economic historians, and they're going to introduce very different topics to us throughout the evening. But my job in the beginning is to talk to you a little bit about economic history as a discipline, explain why it's different to history, and give a little bit of context to the event. So the way the event is going to work is I'm going to do this for 7 to 10 minutes. Then each of our panelists will come up, give their talk for 7 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A at the end, which I'll lead. I'll ask some questions just to get the juices flowing, but we'd love to hear from you, and if you have any questions that come to mind, please do ask them. That would be amazing. The one thing I would say is, if possible, for the next hour or so, if you could not get drinks, I know it's very tempting, and there is a bar, but try not to leave your seats, make sure your phones are on silent, all that good stuff. Let's talk a bit about history and economic history. You've probably heard this expression, history repeats itself. You may not have heard the second half of it. It's because nobody was listening the first time. And this is what historians as a discipline tend to base their kind of ideas on. They're really keen to identify an event happening in the past, an event that's happening in the present, and say, well, clearly these are one and the same. And in fairness, I think a lot of commentary, particularly in journalists and the media, reflect that as well. You do tend to see a lot of people comparing things from the past to the present. The amount of people, for example, that are called, say, Nazis in the media or on social media, that sort of thing. The comparisons that are being drawn, etc., etc. Economic history, though, is probably better summarized with this expression. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Mark Twain apparently said that. And I think anyone who's familiar with poetry knows poems have a rhyming pattern. We're looking for patterns. You're not looking for carbon copies, and if you wait around for a carbon copy, you're going to be waiting a very long time. But if you can spot trends and patterns, long form kind of material, that's when the real good stuff is, and that's what economic history really tries to do. And I should preface these next few slides by saying, by trade, I am a historian. That's what I do. I'm not an economic historian, so I'm allowed to make fun of history as a discipline. Because historians, as much as I love them, they can very much focus in on the small questions that aren't very policy relevant. So things like, why was Henry VIII terrible at relationships? The amount of documentaries you see about Henry VIII and the Tudors is outrageous. And we all know why he was terrible at relationships. It's because his Tinder bio was terrible. But there's other things as well, and this is a genuine. So a friend of mine in the UK received a substantial grant. All he does every day for his research is he wears shoes that were designed 300 years ago. Now, that's an incredible source of money it's incredible to be paid to do that, but it's not going to change the world. It's not particularly policy driving. And this is slightly cut off, but the amount of documentaries that are produced about World War II, I think we get at History Channel. There's so many Hitler's secret X that we can take. I don't know, Hitler's secret girlfriends or drug habits or whatever. But the fact remains, the only thing repeating in history are those documentaries. Economic history, on the other hand, has a much different approach. And because of the way it works and the tools they deploy, they can answer much bigger questions. Because economic historians, they use kind of statistical analysis, big data, AI sort of things to analyze kind of longer form data sets and things historians couldn't even attempt to do. So they can answer much bigger and more important questions, such as the long-term impact of colonialism. You know, why is it that certain countries are wealthier than others? You know, why is it the case that, you know, parts of the world are struggling to catch up with other parts of the world? Why are those head starts? What happens when an economy collapses is always kind of in the back of people's minds, but economic history can actually plot that and plan that. Climate change, you may not think has much to do with economic history, but in reality, there are a lot of cases of temperature changes that led to societal kind of shifts, and using an economic history approach can allow you to answer these questions. It also has specific questions that can answer too. Maybe more recently, something like corruption. Why are people corrupt? How do you circumnavigate corruption? Things that are very pressing today, things like housing crises, are also quite key. And then finally, of course, political change. What happens when certain politicians and certain policies are implemented in, be it Northern Ireland or elsewhere? So this is the usefulness of economic history as a discipline. And to expand on that, I'd like you to welcome to the stage our first panelist. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce the first panelist and they'll introduce the next one. Now, I assure you that it's really, really awkward to just stand up to silence. So if we could have a very enthusiastic and generous round of applause between each speaker, that would be great. Are we okay with that? Okay, so please join me in welcoming our first speaker for the evening, Will Quinn.
Thank you, Andrew. So as a lecturer, I'm used to standing up to silence, and I've never found it awkward before, but I think I might now that you've said that. As Andrew says, economic history is made up of big questions. Maybe the biggest big question is, why are some people rich and some people poor? It's a historical question. It's sort of a question of how did we get here? And everyone started off poor, really. So the question we're asking is, how did some people get so rich, and what can the rest of the world do in order to catch up? And within that, you end up looking at things like the Industrial Revolution, this sort of big bang of living standards, the dips, crises, things like the Great Depression, where we seem to go backwards for a little while. But these big questions are also made up of very small questions, where you can look at specific countries, specific events. And I've got a very small answer to the question of why some people are rich and some people are poor. Some people are poor because they invested in cryptocurrency here. Some people are rich because they invested in cryptocurrency here and managed to sell here. Some people don't know how rich or poor they are because they're still hoping that these prices go back up again. What you might think would be quite lucrative, but actually wasn't, is publishing a history of financial bubbles here. This is what I did in 2020. This is Boom and Bust, a book I wrote with Professor John Turner, who was supposed to be giving this talk, but I broke his foot, so I'm an injury substitution. And what we were looking at is the past 300 years of incidents where prices go up and then prices go down for no obvious reason. It's not like oil prices where there's a war in Ukraine, so prices go up, and other supply chains open, so prices go back down again. There doesn't seem to be any connection and any real rational reason why this would happen. So in here, about a year after the book was published, was when I was getting into lots of arguments about whether this was a bubble or not, which I don't get into so much anymore. But the arguments that we were making were based on these 300 years of experience that we had from writing this book. We came up with this explanation, if you can see, for how bubbles happen. We found that in each of these major financial bubbles, there were three necessary conditions, three sides of the triangle that you needed to be in place. The first is marketability, how easy it is to buy and sell assets. You can buy and sell something really easily, then it becomes much more tempting to buy and sell it in an effort to try to make money whenever the price goes up, which brings you to speculation, which is this what we call this investment strategy, where rather than putting money in your pension fund or holding on to stocks and bonds for the long term for your retirement, you're trading every day or every hour, trying to make money as quickly as possible whenever the prices change. And the last one is money and credit. So whenever people have a lot of money to spend, like they did during COVID, because there was nothing fun to do, people get drawn into just buying and selling these speculative assets and credit. So it's much more tempting to try to make money in these strange get-rich-quick schemes whenever your bank account isn't giving you any interest. And that was the case in 2021. So once these are in place, we find that we argued that there's always a spark. So why do you get a bubble in a particular type of asset, in housing in the 2000s or dot-com stocks in the 1990s rather than somewhere else? And it has to do with this spark. That either comes from politics or technology. And so politics is a change in government policy that makes house prices rise, gets everyone excited, thinking that prices are going to go up again in the future. And then technology is just something that really captures people's attention. This was the internet, and most people thought this also described crypto. So sort of finish with sort of observation, because this obviously happened after Boom and Bust was published, and it would be a second edition before we explain exactly what went on here. But it's widely thought of as a technological bubble. There was sort of the invention of cryptocurrency was something big and exciting that attracted people. But I think it was actually a political bubble. And the reason for that is because there are only really two types of things that crypto is used for. And the first is like borderline fraud, things like market manipulation and dodgy trading practices. And the other is egregious fraud. So money laundering, selling drugs on the internet, and all of this type of thing. And what's special about this type of crime is that governments don't prosecute it anymore. Fraud during 2020 and 2021 was booming, while all the types of crime were falling. And I think this was a big cause of this particular bubble. So I'll now pass you over to Áine Doran, who will talk about pandemics.
Thank you, Will. So yes, I'm going to start off with an apology by saying I'm going to chat about pandemics, which after the last couple of years, people have probably had their fill of as a topic. But it does provide a really good example of where we have maybe somewhat looked to history for some lessons, and maybe an example of where we maybe don't always look to the right bit of history or focus too much on one aspect of history. So when COVID first came about, there was lots of talk about, it as a pandemic being this really unprecedented event. Everyone was very shocked. But if we look at history, we see it maybe shouldn't have been as surprising as it was. Over the last 200 years, we've had several pandemics. COVID was our third one in the last 20 years. So they're maybe not as shocking as we might think they are, or we're maybe sometimes a little bit short term in our thinking about them. But looking back at all these different examples from history give us a great opportunity to learn about pandemics, their timeline, their impacts, and how we can maybe deal with them. So one of the big questions we have when a pandemic happens, particularly in the early stages, is well, how do we deal with it? How do we try and maybe limit the spread of infection? And one of the big ways of doing that before we have vaccines, etc., is through the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions, which sounds very complicated, but it's basically all those different, public health initiatives or advice, or, stay at home, cover your mouth, etc., stay home if you're sick. And these haven't really changed over history. So I know most people probably can't see this, but this is an infographic from during the 1918 Spanish influenza. And if you jazz up the language, modernize it a wee bit, it's saying pretty much exactly the same thing we were told 3 years ago. It's stay at home, cover your mouth, open windows to let ventilation through, wear a face mask. If you have symptoms, don't socialise around people, avoid crowded spaces. So these sort of non-pharmaceutical interventions haven't really changed over time. So policymakers, if they're thinking, well, should we go down the herd immunity route or should we look at other options? We can actually look back at history and see, well, how did these work in the past? And we can see non-pharmaceutical interventions are pretty effective. There's lots of evidence there to suggest that in previous pandemics, when they've been used, they lower mortality rates, they shorten the waves of your different pandemics, and overall shorten the pandemic as a whole. So when policymakers are having these debates, they can look back and see how these policies have worked in history and see, well, do they actually have any impact? Another thing we really learned by looking back at these different pandemics is that it's not really a one size fits all in terms of the mortality impact of the pandemics. It's a real sort of sliding scale. At one end, we have the SARS pandemic back in the early 2000s, where literally about 700 people die. Then the other end of the scale, you have the Spanish influenza in 1918, and you're talking 50 to 100 million people dying there. So you're seeing a lot more variation in the mortality impacts across pandemics. But things that keep coming up are things that are correlated with mortality, so socioeconomic status, gender, age, etc. And we can look at these and maybe target certain groups that might be more impacted or susceptible to certain pandemics. The age aspect also for economic historians and policymakers opens up quite an interesting aspect as well if we look at the Spanish influenza. So people generally think pandemics, older people may be more vulnerable, more likely to die. That wasn't really the case during the Spanish influenza. So a large bulk of those 50 to 100 million deaths were actually happening in your core working age population, your people aged 25 to 35. And people are looking back at this and going, why? Why was that particular cohort of the population so vulnerable, so exposed? And the answer actually maybe comes from exposure to previous pandemics. So there is some research that would suggest it was actually exposure to the Russian flu back in 1890 that maybe explains that quite unique age pattern of the Spanish influenza. So those that were exposed to the Russian flu in 1890 as adults developed some sort of immune protection or some sort of response that offered them a bit of protection against Spanish influenza, whereas those that were exposed in 1890 as young children didn't develop that response, and that's what made them more susceptible to the Spanish influenza. We also think there's possibly a bit of a relationship between Asian flu in the 1950s and swine flu and exposure to that, and that may be offering some protection, and that being why in swine flu we maybe saw a higher proportion of cases and deaths in the under 60s than we might have expected. So if we can identify these relationships, or at least be aware that prior exposure can offer potentially some sort of protection, we might be able to say, well, when another pandemic happens, if we can establish some relationship, we might go, well, those are the groups most sort of at risk from death. We can also see a lot of information about the economic impact across pandemics. And again, this is generally quite severe, regardless of what the mortality impact was. So SARS, we've already said, very minimal death impact, but quite a substantial economic impact, particularly for Asian economies. So we're talking like trillions of dollars of a loss in GDP, huge impacts on the stock market, big drops in house prices, etc. Because even though the pandemic didn't end up being as severe as people thought, people still took action to sort of protect themselves. So they stopped buying things that they didn't need to buy, they were cut back on shopping, socialising, cut back on holidays, etc. So all of that had impacts on the economy, even though the pandemic wasn't that severe. So sometimes it's just the fear of the pandemic that causes the economic impact without the pandemic itself actually being very severe. We're also starting to see now more models being built to sort of predict sort of hypothetical or future pandemics and what their economic impact might be based on the experience of historical pandemics. So using different pandemics as benchmarks for minor pandemics or more severe pandemics, and trying to estimate what our potential economic impact is there to again allow policymakers to maybe be a little bit more prepared for them. Another area that's really developing in terms of research is this impact of in utero exposure. So those that are exposed to pandemics when they're in utero. And this is where being able to look back on history and take a longer term approach offers us a lot of insight that we might not have had. So there's this real growing body of evidence that those that were in utero during the Spanish influenza had real long-term knock-on effects. So we see lower educational attainment, lower income, much higher rates of disability, chronic conditions, higher rates of hospitalisation well into old age. So literally 70, 80 years after the pandemic's over, we're still incurring long-term indirect costs of it. So the costs of the pandemics are maybe lasting a lot longer than we might anticipate. And if we can look back in history and develop this relationship or understand this relationship, then again, maybe we can look at those that were in utero during different pandemics and say, well, maybe they need a bit more targeted healthcare to try and prevent these cases becoming more severe down the line. So I'm going to finish up with 2 points. First one is that pandemics are a great example of where we can look back on history and learn from. But I think our experience during COVID is also a bit of an example of how we shouldn't maybe be too blinkered in our use of history and focus in too much on one particular event and try and look at the broader picture. So this is something David Cameron has admitted in the COVID inquiry that's ongoing, that the UK prepared for the wrong pandemic. And we see it across the academic literature as well. Everyone is focused on the Spanish influenza because it's the big headline one with the huge mortality impact. But we're not really thinking about the fact there's been huge changes in living standards, medicine, hygiene practices have all come on a lot. So we've focused in on this one big pandemic and maybe overlooked the others, and that's maybe impacted some of our preparedness plans in a way. And the final, maybe somewhat depressing note to end on is COVID is not going to be our last pandemic. Climate change means we actually face a heightened risk of pandemics, and again, we've seen this in history. The Black Death started because of climate change. There was global warming and that drove rats from rural areas into urban areas, and that's how the disease spread. And you don't have to look far outside to know we're going through a bit of a climate crisis. We're seeing all these climate change, it's disrupting habitats, changing how we interact with animals. So history tells us there's going to be more pandemics, but hopefully history will also help us get prepared for those next pandemics. So on that maybe somewhat depressing note, I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Áine. Very, very interesting. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. It's going to be all about the Great Depression. Right? And I'm going to try and make it slightly less depressing than it sounds, but it is actually quite depressing because I'm going to be talking about the importance of ideas, the ideas that policymakers have. Where do they come from? Who influences them? Why do they make the trade-offs, make the decisions that they actually end up making? So who's this guy? Does anyone know who this guy is? The most important economist of the 20th century. Keynes, yes. John Maynard Keynes. There he is sitting with his book in an armchair pontificating. And one of his very famous pontifications is this. I'm not going to read it all out, but I'm just going to highlight this. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Okay? So, this is from his most famous work, his General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which he wrote in the context of the Great Depression. He was trying to understand what caused this mega disaster in the 1930s. And his theories have gone on to influence a lot of economic policy subsequently. But he was looking back on the 1930s and also the 1920s, and that the big thing that he was interested in was the gold standard. The gold standard was a monetary regime that existed until, or roughly speaking, the Great Depression brought it to an end. And it was a monetary regime that policymakers reintroduced in 1924, during the Roaring Twenties, because they had seen it work before. They had gone through, the policy-making people, in their 50s and 60s, had experienced a previous era in which they had had a monetary regime based on gold in the late 19th century up until World War I. And they thought, oh, it worked then, let's reintroduce that. It's going to work again. It's going to bring stability. Instead of a fiat currency like we have now, where the value of our money depends on economic sentiment, the size of our economy, it's a sort of informal link with the tax base, well, that kind of thing. It's based in a gold standard totally on a weight in gold. You could go to the Bank of England with your pound notes and demand, the equivalent in gold bars, right? You won't get very many, but it has a sort of a valuable metal underpinning. Now, John Maynard Keynes here thought it was a disaster policy to reintroduce because it limited money supply. It was very restrictive, and in fact, he was proven right. He wrote about this in the 20s, and we saw it actually as a major contributing factor to the Great Depression. We had deflation. That's not when prices rise like we see at the moment. That's when things fall, and they fall quite dramatically year in, year out, which is worse, seriously worse than high levels of inflation, because it delays investment decisions. Why buy something now when you can wait a month or two? It's going to get cheaper. So it brings the economy to a halt, right? Also means if you borrow money now, you can't pay it back because the goods and services you produce as a firm are not going to be worth much, right? So, you know, it's, in the housing market, we call this negative equity. You might have heard that before. But, you know, if this is an economy-wide phenomenon, as the Great Depression was, we're in trouble. So, I've done a lot of work with my co-author sitting over there, Philip Fleers, on the context of the Netherlands, a small open economy, very developed economy, and really interestingly, the very last country to maintain the gold standard, all the way up to 1936. Britain already left in 1931. The original Brexit was when Britain bombed out of the gold standard. The Netherlands, Dutch policymakers, they stuck to it all the way. Here, you can't see it very well. We do something called counterfactual analysis, counterfactual simulations. This is what economic historians do. This is one of the things that we bring to policy making. We can look at what-if alternative histories. We can look at the actual path of history, which is this black line here. So for economic activity, GDP, or inflation. And here at the bottom is unemployment. That's what really happened, and then we can simulate what could have happened if different policy choices would have been made. So we simulate, based on the recent history of how these variables in the economy relate to each other, what could have happened if they would have left the gold standard alongside Britain in 1931. And we find in our macroeconomic simulations that it would have meant higher economic activity. They wouldn't have had a Great Depression. It means higher levels of inflation, reasonable 2, 3, 4% rather than negative 10, negative 20% year in, year out. And also much lower levels of unemployment. We wouldn't have had the mass unemployment problems that we did see all over the world. The interesting comparison, of course, is with Britain, which didn't really have a Great Depression, not like the United States. By leaving the gold standard, it was much more flexible. Policymakers were much less constrained in their policy making and could actually adopt policies that sort of mitigated the impact of the Great Depression. So that comparison between countries and that comparison with alternative universes where the country could have chosen a different set of policies, that's the power of economic history for policy making. I'm particularly proud of my meme. This is the Dutch Prime Minister at the time of the crisis in the 30s. His name is Hendrikus Colijn, and he he brought the Netherlands into the gold standard in 1924. He was finance minister at the time, and then he was elevated to being prime minister in the early 30s, and he doggedly stuck with this policy, even for massive opposition, even within his cabinet. In fact, his cabinet resigned over this, and he was forced to go to the Queen and beg for no elections. In fact, he wasn't really begging at all. He blackmailed the Dutch Queen into basically giving him another chance at forming an alternative cabinet, because he said, if you don't allow me to do this, the guilder will collapse, the guilder will fall, and it will be on your head. Right? So he was able to cobble together very undemocratically continued cabinet, a minority government for further 5 years of crippling austerity was the result of his policies informed by a very old-fashioned view of the way the economy worked. A view that was no longer relevant. The gold standard no longer had this pro-growth stability impact. It had quite the opposite, and against all the evidence, he doggedly continued this old policy and didn't reconsider. It wasn't evidence-based policy making at all. It was dogma-based. It was what John Maynard Keynes was warning us about. right? So to bring my little spiel here to a close, basically the power of ideas in policy making, we need to be very conscious what is informing what policymakers do. You know, where do their ideas come from? Are they the relevant ideas? Are they evidence based? Or are policymakers captured by old thinking, irrelevant thinking that actually can do more harm than good? And the power of economic history is we can look at historical cases like the Great Depression. And see how things work then, and you know it can be a warning for policy making today and in the future. So thanks very much. I'll hand you back to Andrew.
Right. Well, thank you very much to our panelists. We've now entered the Q&A portion. So we all have these lovely lapel mics. You guys don't. I did ask to mic up the room, but apparently it wasn't in the budget. So if you do want to ask a question, make sure you have this in front of you. I think there is another one as well that we can circulate too. But before I start asking questions, would anyone like to open proceedings, or are you happy for me? Oh, straight away. Go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. You say we don't listen. We had 2008, the crash in 2008. Why are we not listening, or where's the fault?
Who said? To me. Okay. Let me think. So why didn't they listen in 2008?
Yeah, well, 2008 happened.
Yes.
So we had ones before 2008.
Right.
And you said, "I told you so."
Yes.
So where are we going wrong, or who's going wrong? What's happening?
I would argue that to some extent they forgot the past, the distant past, the recent past even. The Bank of England forgot how bank runs worked. They you know, what caused them. So there was a lack of historical reflection. Now, one thing that I will say for policymakers in the United States is they did very rapidly learn the lessons. So if you look at the 2008 crisis, they performed much better in the recovery than Britain did. They didn't make the same mistakes. In the UK, we went for an austerity policy, which the United States had tried before in the 30s. It didn't work then, and it didn't work for us now. In the United States, they did something quite different, and that's probably because the chief policymakers at the time were actually economic historians. Ben Bernanke was in charge of the United States central bank, the Federal Reserve, and his work is on the Great Depression. So, you know, sometimes it takes putting an economic historian in charge so that we can. I'm available, but maybe give more power to us, and then we can. Maybe we need an office for the economic historian, right, to advise policymakers. It's a compulsory part of the legislative process, and to make sure that we do remember the past. Yes, I hope I've waffled enough. I'll give you back.
This wasn't supposed to be Chris putting out his CV, by the way. But, any other questions from the audience? One over here. Can we pass that mic athletically through the crowd? I would do it, but I have a damaged ankle.
Yes.
Amazing.
What dead economists and economic theories have a control over today's government and central banks, you think?
Is that for me or for Will?
Yeah, it's got to be
for me.
It's definitely not for me.
Well, I had up there on the slide John Maynard Keynes. He was warning us, about dead economists. He's now the dead economist that still today central banks are very much influenced by. So one of the big ideas from his work is that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and that idea is still very central to the models that policymakers in central banks devise today to understand the way the economy works. It's a modernized form of Keynesianism, but it's still central to the policy-making process, and maybe we need to reconsider that.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in now because I have a question for Will. This isn't the last time that we're going to see one of these kind of scams come to the fore. What do you think the next one's going to be? What shape will it take? Is it going to be kind of an online coin sort of based thing? And how do you identify it and how do you avoid getting sucked up in it? Or is it good to be sucked up in it and then sell high and then you're wealthy?
That's up to you. How much do you like risk? So what we find is that there are necessary conditions. So when are you going to get it? You'll get it when interest rates are very low. They're quite high at the moment, so this makes it a lot less likely. You get it when there's an increase in marketability, when things are becoming easier to buy and sell. And then the specific asset that you get a bubble in is determined by either politics or technology. So if you look for an area where there's sort of big technology that people are getting excited about, it's a solid possibility that you'll get a financial bubble in that. The obvious one at the moment is AI. It's hard to tell what stage that's at, but that's something that could happen, especially if interest rates go back down again. In terms of politics, there are sort of several ways that governments can spark a bubble. The most common one is by deregulating. So they deregulate something, they deregulate housing, they deregulate housing finance, and this is what causes the bubble to start growing. So the thing to look out for there would be, what are governments relaxing the rules on? And that's how you sort of think, okay, there's a risk of a bubble here.
Okay. So don't invest in AI, or do?
I don't know, it depends when.
Fair enough. Any questions from the audience? Or shall I keep going? I'll continue. Oh, yeah, the microphone was... Yeah, that's probably easier.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. You may not know the answer to this, to be honest, and I was out for the start of it, so apologies. But I suppose, obviously we're having this contextual discussion with the sort of wider situation in Northern Ireland, where we actually don't have the fiscal levers in a lot of these areas to make the kinds of changes that we probably would all agree, maybe we wouldn't all agree, but certainly that we could reach a public consensus about. And I think there's a public conversation that needs to happen about that, and it sort of marries up quite well with the sort of levelling up agenda and giving more power to place and trying to figure out how we get the economic benefits of prosperity down to the people who need it most. So my question, really that wasn't very succinct, but the question is, are there examples throughout history where, I suppose, greater devolution of fiscal powers have contributed in a beneficial way to greater prosperity and more broad-based prosperity? Yeah. Sorry, it's quite rambling.
It's a very good question, and I'm going to give a very depressing answer, which was, this is not the first time we've tried devolution in this country. We had an earlier period of devolution where Northern Ireland had its own parliament and its own prime minister, its own political system, and my colleague at Queen's, David Jordan, has worked on this, and it doesn't look good. It contributed to the Troubles, essentially, and there was huge corruption during this time. The productivity in Northern Ireland was really poor then, just as it is at the moment. So devolution didn't have, in that earlier period, having a lot more fiscal levers than devolved governments do today in, say, Scotland. It didn't have a positive impact because it was captured by certain groups and exploited to their ends at the cost of wider society, a cost to everyone. So it's a warning from history of how not to do devolution.
Any other audience questions?
Not so much a question, but more, can I offer the example of quasi-Kwarteng as why economic historians should not be policymakers?
I'm going to say we disown him. But also, just to clarify, he is not an economic historian. He is a historian of economic thought. Something quite different.
Something only an economic
We look at
historian
the
would
history
say.
of the economy, he looks at the history of the economic ideas. And so he was captured by the old ideas.
Okay, well, I'll go
That's
for another
the
one then.
difference.
Boris Johnson, during the pandemic, I believe his major was in history.
Yes, but
Obviously,
like,
a lot of classics sort of
Yeah.
stuff thrown in too, which maybe doesn't help with the pandemic response, but I stand by my quasi-Kwarteng observation.
just don't put anyone who went to Oxford in charge, I think. Yeah.
Thank good for burning that bridge with Oxford, Chris. Thanks. Any other audience questions? We've got one closer. We'll go for the closer one just for reasons geographic.
Deflation ever be positive to an economic sort of system?
I think the consensus among economists is that it's much more dangerous than inflation. We probably need mild inflation to help with dealing with population growth, and it creates the right incentive structure, 2-3%, whatever that is. But if we go too extreme in either way, 0% is. We've had that for a long while. Wasn't great. Negative numbers are periods of economic collapse. So probably deflation worse than inflation. Yeah.
So we'll pass the mic over, and while it's making that journey, I'd like to ask Áine, if you're looking at kind of modern pandemics and that sort of thing, there's that expression, modern problems require modern solutions, but you're kind of advocating for looking back as well and looking at the past. So to what extent is it really applicable?
I think it's sort of looking at the past as maybe our starting point. So obviously there's certain medicine technology has come on a long way. So 1918, very different living standards, hygiene practices. Spanish influenza happens today. Probably don't see 100 million people die because medicine has come on so far, much more hygienic, etc. People can work from home much more easily. But I think it still provides that starting point where we can look and see, well, this is what happened. How do we maybe adapt that for modern day situations? So the non-pharmaceutical interventions, they haven't really changed over 100 years. So those, sometimes it's the simple things don't change over time, and we can look back and see how those worked. And if we'd look back in 1918 and said, well, actually saying those things had made zero difference and actually maybe lengthened the pandemic, well, then you might have had an argument to go, well, do you know what, maybe herd immunity was the right way to go. So I think, adapt history for modern, but use it as your starting point for at least the discussion, because at least it's giving you something to build upon.
Right, question over here.
Is it the maximum 21 million supply of Bitcoin that makes it so valuable, do you think? Well,
that's what they said about gold. It's finite resource, But,
so I think he's trolling me. I'm a famous Bitcoin hater. So I think anything in economics, sort of principle of economics is that something is worth what people are willing to pay for it, and that's the only thing that gives Bitcoin value, is the fact that people are willing to pay for it, which is actually a limitation. Other things have value because they're useful for something. If no one was willing to pay for Bitcoin, it wouldn't be useful for anything. At the moment, it's useful as possibly a speculative investment if the price goes up, and it's useful for buying drugs on the internet, but that's only because someone's willing to pay for it, and if that weren't the case, it wouldn't have any value at all. The other thing to say is that, economics is all about scarcity, is another thing that economics is about. Things have a value because they're scarce. So anything that has a price must by definition be scarce. There's no price of air because air isn't scarce enough to put a price on. So in this case, Bitcoin is nothing special. Scarcity is just what every asset has.
Yeah. Yes, a short journey for the mic.
I was wondering if you could talk at all to whether or not you talk about learning lessons from the past. If you look at where we are today, are we, at the UK level, for example, learning the right lessons from the past, other than the fact that, so you look at the 70s, other than the fact that houses were, about 20 quid, are we learning the right lessons in how we tackle, a housing crisis, how we tackle the cost of living crisis? That's a long-winded way of saying, is it working?
Were you reading my list? Word out of my head.
Do you want to start?
I think each of you could answer that, because that's a really good question. Yeah.
Will I start?
I think that there is a tendency to overlearn the previous lesson. So after the 2008 crash, there was an austerity budget. So they weren't pouring enough money into the economy. They were trying to close the deficit too quickly, and this was a mistake that sort of meant that the British economy lagged behind the American economy. Coming out then from the COVID crisis, they erred in completely the wrong direction, sort of trying to stimulate the economy too much, and created inflation and created a cost of living crisis. So part of history is more about having a broader frame of reference, sort of looking back to previous recoveries from pandemics, which do tend to be much sharper than recoveries from financial crises, which are always very slow and require quite a lot of stimulus. So that's where I think policymakers have gone wrong recently.
Yeah, and I think we're sometimes, when we look back at history, we're quite blinkered. We focus in on the big disasters or the big things or the things that people remember. History is a very long period of time. There's a lot of history that's happened, but we focus in on the big things, and I think that's where we sometimes go wrong. We forget that there's a broader picture. So it's like focusing in, and academics do it too, focusing in on Spanish influenza because it's the big sort of sexy pandemic, because it's the one with the big mortality, and that's where the young people die, and it's much maybe more interesting to talk about. But when you look at the statistics, it's the milder ones that happen more often and that we're maybe more likely to face, and yet they're totally ignored in preparedness plans and academic research and policy and everything. So we're looking in at maybe sometimes the big things in history and forgetting the smaller bits that we're maybe more likely to face and can learn from as well.
Your parallel there with the 70s or the 60s and 70s is a good one, and I don't think one that policymakers are learning from. So they're not learning. This was a period of a perma-crisis, of high levels of inflation, high levels of unemployment, and history doesn't map perfectly onto the present. It never does. But there are things within that historical context that we could learn about, the relationship between different things. And I don't think we're doing that. And is it the mistake of academic economic historians or policymakers? I mean, it's both. Right, so maybe we're too much talking to ourselves in our academic journals, we need to go out there and talk to policymakers directly, but they probably don't understand econometrics and statistical significance, so they couldn't read a counterfactual graph, right? So they can't do that. So we need to translate what we say into digestible nuggets. Famously Boris Johnson, didn't read, right? So someone needed to had like 30 seconds or 90 seconds. I was told by a very senior economist within a civil service working at the time. She had, or he, I won't say who it is, but had 90 seconds to basically give the information, present the policy options. So something that civil service economists had been working on for months and months and months has to be distilled to 90 seconds. So that's a skill that academics maybe we don't have, and we need to learn. Otherwise, we're going to be ignored.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big issues, that we have this a bridge that needs built between academics and policymakers. There's too big of a gap, because reading any academic paper on pandemics, pretty much every conclusion says findings in this paper will help with preparedness plans for future pandemics. The policymakers weren't looking at the academic papers, so we need to build that bridge, because, like you've said, the academic papers are written for an academic audience and based on what journal editors want. It's not about necessarily being accessible to everyone, so it's building that bridge and trying to make that connect between academic research and policy and the general public, so that everyone can access it and sort of learn some of the lessons from the past.
I think it's worth highlighting as well that goes both ways. It's not that academics expect everyone else to understand what they do. The onus is on the academic to try and make their research more digestible, be it through events like this or through journal articles that aren't written in jargon, or whatever it may be. It's a very important point. Any other audience question in the middle there, and one here as well.
Thank you. I suppose that's probably for yourself, Chris, but we saw the bank rate today. Bank of England held their bank rate as of the US Fed yesterday. Okay, and I suppose interest rates have been on the rise lately, at least now they're levelling off, but it's not probably the case that for a long time interest rates were almost nearly too low. Are there any insights there from kind of the economic history that we can use today for interest rates or stuff like that?
Chris, what might be one that you could answer?
Sure. So it was a tricky spot that the policymakers were in when interest rates were low, because the interest rates are set by the central bank, and the central bank is supposed to target inflation, and inflation is quite tightly defined, so all the consumer price index. So while inflation was running at 2% or below 2%, they didn't really have the option to increase interest rates, even though you could see this sort of popping out in other areas of the economy, particularly investment assets like housing and stocks, where you were starting to think maybe this is going to cause a problem. So it's a bit of an institutional explanation for why that didn't happen. You could definitely argue that they didn't respond quickly enough. There was this time when they were worried about transient inflation and worried not to overreact and not to raise interest rates too quickly. With hindsight, that looks like a mistake. And again, it could be a perspective thing where they'd been making a mistake in one direction, just underestimating inflation for so long that whenever, or sort of overestimating inflation risk for so long that whenever sort of real signs of inflation started to come along, they weren't thinking long term enough and looking back to previous. They stopped believing in inflation almost as a result of that.
I want to add to that. We usually think of the interest rates as the main policy tool of central banks, and today we think the thing that they're targeting is purely inflation. Central banks in the past had different functions. In fact, some central banks today have different functions. If you look at the United States, they also think about unemployment. So maybe it's worth them also considering things like that. There's talk now that central bankers should also think about climate change. Maybe that's going too far. Maybe we need the Department for the Environment to look at that. Having one institution that looks at everything and tries to balance everything against each other is basically impossible, especially if you've just got one policy tool, one policy instrument, interest rate. But of course they don't. They have a lot more things to at their disposal, as we've seen with the quantitative easing policy that somehow appeared from nowhere. Of course it didn't appear from nowhere. It was tried before in the past, for example, in the Netherlands in the 1930s. And why did they use it then? All these exotic instruments, because they weren't targeting inflation back then, they're targeting having a fixed exchange rate. So they were very creative, inventing all kinds of weird and wonderful policy instruments that have been kind of reinvented recently and they're considered brand new, but there's historical precedent for them. Just though people designing them maybe weren't aware. So they maybe were thinking they were doing untested waters, but they did have a comparison they could have made but failed to see. Yeah.
There's a question in the front.
To go back to
but think of the audio track.
To go back to the policy makers, I think it's the Conservatives and like Labour to speak. Does history side with either one group? So maybe that's why they're not taking it on board and saying, oh no, we're not going to go down this route of like Keynesian and so forth, because it's not a Labour policy or a Conservative policy.
I think in terms of the economic models that politicians use, there's a much more of a consensus today. The big camps of Keynesians versus monetarists or Friedmanites is much less so. Although it does pop up occasionally. Think of our disastrous Prime Minister last year. She had, the one that was in power for less than a month. That one. She took quite an extreme a set of policy ideas, but generally, if you look, both parties, there's kind of a more of a consensus. But of course, they have different interest groups. But who are your conservative voters? They're very old, right? So their interests are aligned with, people of a much more, higher age group, shall we say, although you wouldn't think so given the pandemic policy. Labour have a much younger constituency. So, and we can look at how that maybe has changed across time. I mean, Tories have pretty much always been about the old established, successful elements of society, right? But they've been trying to woo the working class. That's maybe different.
I think the issue as well, politicians generally, no matter what side, they never come out particularly well in history. Someone's always done something wrong, so I think that's maybe why there's a hesitancy to look back as well, because they're looking back at maybe failures of their predecessors.
And of course, a recent Prime Minister, I know there's been many, but one whose name begins with a B, famously, of course, thought of himself as Churchill and made comparisons with World War II and stuff like that. But, so you say, okay, so there's a politician who is taking interest in the past, but probably the wrong past, the irrelevant past, right? So, need to be wary of that, of hubris.
Past for his ego.
Yeah, past for his, wax his own, yeah.
Any other questions? Conscious of time, so I'll just finish things up with one question that you can all answer. This is all about kind of identifying patterns, etc., etc. So, when was the last time you thought you saw something and thought to yourself, "Oh, here we go again"?
Anytime I watch the news.
Most recently, then.
This morning. Because I think I know we've said history doesn't repeat itself, but it does sort of go in these. There's elements of repeating and elements of going in cycles. So even short-term history, we're seeing similar things happen all the time. So I know I've said about us being short-sighted. Sometimes we're far too short-sighted. We don't even look back a couple of years ago. But I think we're constantly going through these cycles, and it's happening. It is literally here we go again, here we go again, here we go again. And I think sometimes we're going here we go again, but not going, well, we're going again. What did we do last time, and how can we learn from it?
Yeah, I think the news, if you sort of come back to what you were saying about the 60s and 70s when housing was affordable for normal people, this was essentially a question of supply and a question of these political economy problems where old people are voting to keep house prices high because so many of them own the houses. And the last time I see, every time I turn on the news, and when I really think here we go again, is whenever the Conservatives have U-turned again on affordable housing.
Fair.
We just need history or time to stop a little bit so we can take stock of what happened, don't we? Just press the pause button, like I do on computer games all the time. I'm big into city planners, so we can design my ideal city.
Utopia.
Utopian city, and then you walk around Belfast and you think, maybe they need to play some of these computer games, which are often based on the past. They're models of actual cities and the way people interact with them. Usually the wrong kinds of cities because they're United States based, whereas the car is essential. Last time I thought, here we go again, was actually on the taxi journey here. We were in the same taxi coming down from Riddle Hall, and the taxi driver was explaining to us his fare regime. In Belfast, there is a maximum fare, not a minimum, in a market dominated by 3 taxi firms who have incredible market power. It's a monopsony, right? So we have with employment law, we've created the minimum wage to prevent situations where workers are being exploited by their employer. It looks like the same thing is happening in taxis, taxi markets. But of course, we don't think of taxi drivers as employees because they're self-employed. They actually pay a fee to their taxi firm. They pay Phonacab, Uber, or Value Cab a weekly or monthly fee to be able to be a taxi driver. So they don't come under the legislation of minimum wage. We introduced the minimum wage in this country, a very successful policy that has decreased the divergence between rich and poor, and helped with improve living standards at the lower end of the socioeconomic distribution. Yet this policy doesn't apply to the self-employed or the supposedly self-employed, and maybe we need a minimum taxi fare. They haven't changed in Belfast. The taxi fares haven't changed apparently for over a decade. Yet the cost of living has increased a lot, and it's very difficult to get a taxi at the moment. In case you haven't noticed, maybe that's the reason it doesn't pay. And these monopolist taxi firms have too much market power, and they can exploit their workers. We can look at the lessons from the minimum wage success. Let's roll that out to other sectors. Recent history.
I should say, in the taxi driver said, "There's no economics in my job, and I've never seen a fire light up in Chris's eyes quite as intensely." as he sat back and thought, oh, here we go, you're in a car with me now. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's our time. So I'd like to thank our panelists, the bar staff, McHugh's, and everyone else. And thank you for coming. Conversation can be continued over a pint, but again, thank you very much.
Thank you.